Daniel slid the papers across my kitchen table as if they were nothing more than a grocery list. "You'll be safer at Brookstone Senior Living," he said calmly. "It's time to sell this house." The room went quiet. My hands were still resting on the edge of the old oak table Robert had built 40 years ago. The same table where birthday cakes had been cut, where Christmas mornings had begun, where my son had once done his homework while I made dinner. Now that same son was telling me I had to leave. Vanessa sat beside him perfectly composed, her manicured fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked prepared. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun settled over the backyard rose garden Robert had planted before he died. The roses were blooming again this year. They always did. "You don't need to worry about anything," Daniel continued. "We've already spoken with a consultant. He'll help us get everything arranged." Consultant, such a small, polite word for something that suddenly felt enormous. From the hallway, I heard someone shift their weight. A man I didn't recognize stood near the doorway holding a leather folder against his chest. He watched the room quietly, like someone who had been invited to witness a transaction. Vanessa glanced at him briefly, then back at me. I noticed the way she and Daniel avoided looking at each other, the way people do when they've rehearsed something too carefully. For a moment, no one spoke. I simply looked down at the papers, and that was when a strange calm settled over me. Not anger, not panic, just the quiet realization that something about this moment didn't make sense. Something was very wrong. But before I tell you how that afternoon began to unravel, let me take you back a little. My name is Susan Ellis. I'm 73 years old, and until recently I had lived in the same house on Willow Creek Drive in Naperville, Illinois, for 37 years. If you're listening to this story right now, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me your city in the comments. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. And if stories about family truth resonate with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to my story. The house Daniel wanted me to leave wasn't just a house. It was the place Robert and I had built our life together. We bought it in 1987 when Naperville still felt more like a quiet town than a Chicago suburb. Back then, the neighborhood had fewer trees and more empty lots. The house itself was modest, 2 stories pale, siding a small porch, but to us, it felt enormous. Robert planted the first rose bushes in the backyard the spring after we moved in. He said every home needed something beautiful growing behind it. Over the years, the garden grew wider. So did our lives. Daniel learned to ride his bike on that street. Birthday parties filled the backyard. Holidays brought relatives who stayed too long and ate too much pie. And when Robert passed away 8 years ago, that same house held the quiet that followed. After his death, many people suggested I move somewhere smaller. But the truth was, I never felt alone there. The house was full of familiar rhythms. Mornings started with coffee by the kitchen window. I'd watch the neighborhood wake up dog walkers, school buses, the occasional jogger passing beneath the maples. 3 mornings a week I volunteered at the Naperville Public Library shelving books and helping people find whatever story they were looking for. Afternoons were usually spent in the garden. Robert's roses needed attention, and I liked talking to them while I worked. It sounds silly, I know, but plants like people seem to appreciate being spoken to kindly. My life wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful. Daniel and Vanessa lived about 40 minutes away in the city. They visited on holidays, sometimes on weekends, and that arrangement had always worked just fine. Until about 6 months ago, that was when their visits started becoming frequent. At first, I thought they were simply checking in more often. Daniel had been busy with his job as a financial advisor, and Vanessa worked part-time in real estate. Life had always moved quickly for them, but suddenly they were stopping by almost every week, sometimes twice. They'd bring takeout or a bottle of wine, sit in the living room and ask questions. Small questions at first. "How are the stairs treating you, Mom? Do you ever worry about being here alone? Have you thought about downsizing?" At first, I laughed them off. "I've been climbing these stairs for 37 years, I told Daniel once. If they were going to defeat me, they would have done it by now." He smiled politely. But the questions didn't stop. Instead, they slowly changed tone. Daniel began pointing out things I had never worried about before. The driveway was too long. The neighborhood was getting busier. The house required too much maintenance. Vanessa once walked through the kitchen running her fingers along the counter like she was inspecting a property. "You know," she said casually, "homes in this area are selling very well right now." I remember looking up from the sink. "That's nice," I said. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But little by little, the visits stopped feeling like family time. They felt like evaluations. And then one Thursday afternoon, Daniel arrived earlier than usual. Vanessa came with him, but they weren't alone. The unfamiliar man from the hallway stepped fully into the kitchen, adjusting his tie with a practiced motion. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, "this is Andrew Keller." The man nodded politely. "I'm a senior care consultant," he explained, and in that moment, standing in my own kitchen watching a stranger open a folder at my table, a cold realization settled quietly into my chest. Something about this visit was very different. Something about it was very wrong. And I had the sudden feeling that my son had not come here just to see me. Andrew Keller didn't waste any time. He opened the leather folder he had been carrying and carefully spread several documents across the kitchen table. The papers slid toward me in a neat stack, their crisp edges catching the late afternoon light from the window. Daniel remained standing beside him, arms crossed loosely, watching my reaction with a calmness that felt strangely rehearsed. Vanessa leaned against the counter a few steps away, her expression patient, almost expectant, as if she had already seen this entire conversation play out before. "These are simply preliminary care arrangement forms, Mrs. Ellis," Andrew said in a smooth professional tone. "Standard documentation when a family is helping a loved one transition into a safer living environment." Safer living environment. The phrase sounded polished, like something practiced many times. I looked down at the stack of papers. Each page was crowded with dense lines of printed text and legal phrases I didn't immediately recognize. Words like authorization, oversight, and administrative control appeared again and again in narrow columns that made my eyes struggle to follow the meaning. "I'm not moving anywhere," I said quietly. Daniel exhaled through his nose the way someone does when they've already had this conversation too many times. "Mom," he said patiently, "we've talked about this. You live alone in a 2-story house. If something happened to you, no one would know for hours. I've managed just fine for years." Vanessa finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "It's not about today," she said. "It's about making sure you're safe tomorrow." Andrew nodded slightly, reinforcing her point. "Brookstone Senior Living is actually one of the nicest communities in the area," he added. "Private apartments, medical staff on site, social programs. Many residents say they feel far more comfortable once they settle in." The way he described it made it sound less like a facility and more like a vacation resort. Still, something about the way the three of them stood there together made the room feel strangely small. "I'd like to read these first," I said, turning one of the pages slowly. Daniel checked his watch. "We actually need to finish this today," he said. "Andrew has another appointment later and Brookstone needs confirmation by the end of the week." Andrew offered an apologetic smile. "The administrative process can be somewhat time-sensitive." Time-sensitive. Everything about this suddenly seemed urgent. I tried reading the first paragraph again, but the language was complicated and formal, the kind written by lawyers who assumed everyone else spoke the same language they did. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked. Daniel stepped closer and tapped one of the pages. "That part is just a temporary power of attorney," he said casually. "It allows me to handle some paperwork while everything gets arranged." Temporary. Vanessa slid a pen toward me. "This really just makes the process easier," she said. "Otherwise the paperwork could drag on for months." Months. The word echoed in my mind while I stared at the document. I thought about the quiet mornings in this house, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, the sunlight on Robert's rose bushes outside the window. "I'm not sick," I said softly. "No one said you were," Daniel replied quickly, "but planning ahead is the responsible thing to do." Andrew leaned forward slightly, pointing to another section of the page. This authorization simply allows your son to coordinate financial and logistical matters during the transition, he explained. Utilities, administrative communication, and property management while you settle into Brookstone. His words came quickly, confidently, like someone who had delivered the same explanation many times. Daniel rested his hand on the edge of the table near mine. "Mom," he said gently, lowering his voice, "we're just trying to help you." For a moment, I studied his face. The boy who had once ridden his bicycle down this street with crooked training wheels was now standing across from me explaining legal authority over my own life. Vanessa nudged the pen a little closer. "It's just paperwork," she said quietly. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to push the papers back across the table and ask all three of them to leave. But another part of me wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe this was simply what happened when you reached a certain age. Maybe children eventually began organizing things for you. "Just sign at the bottom of each page," Andrew said calmly. The pen felt heavier than it should have. For a second, I didn't move. Across the table, Vanessa tapped her fingers lightly against the wood, the small rhythm filling the silence. Daniel glanced at his watch and exhaled impatiently. Andrew Keller cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, trying to sound polite, "the paperwork. Just needs your signature so we can move forward." My eyes drifted briefly to the photograph on the wall beside the kitchen doorway. Robert stood there in the picture, smiling the way he always did when the roses first bloomed in spring. For a moment, the room felt smaller than it had a minute before. Then Daniel slid the pen a little closer to my hand. I signed the first page, then the second, then another. Each signature took only a few seconds, but with every line of ink, my uneasiness grew a little stronger. When I finished, Daniel quickly gathered the papers together, aligning them into a tidy stack. Vanessa finally took a sip of her coffee. "Well," she said lightly, "that wasn't so hard." Andrew closed his folder and stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis," he said politely. "This will make the transition much smoother." Transition. Daniel walked him toward the hallway, already discussing timelines and arrangements. Vanessa remained in the kitchen with me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached down and picked up a single page that had slipped slightly from the stack Daniel was carrying. "Oh," she said, casually. "You might want to see this." She turned the paper toward me. At the top was a logo I recognized immediately. Redwood Valley Realty. Below it was a property estimate report. My address appeared clearly near the top of the page. Willow Creek Drive, Naperville, Illinois. My eyes moved slowly down the document, and then I saw the number. Estimated market value, $780,000. For a moment, I thought I had read it wrong. $780,000. Outside the window, the roses Robert planted years ago moved gently in the afternoon breeze. Daniel stepped back into the kitchen just as I was still staring at the page. Vanessa's smile was small, satisfied. "That's the current market estimate," she said. Neither of them sounded surprised, and suddenly the urgency of the paperwork, the consultant, and Brookstone Senior Living all seemed to fall into place. I looked down at the pages I had just signed. A cold realization began forming quietly in my mind. What had I just signed? For the first time in 37 years, the house on Willow Creek Drive no longer felt like my home. Daniel and Vanessa began visiting almost every day after the paperwork was signed. At first they said they were only helping me prepare for the transition, but the way they moved through the house made it clear they already believed the place belonged to someone else. Vanessa was the one who took charge of most things. She arrived with cardboard boxes, rolls of packing tape, and the brisk efficiency of someone organizing a garage sale rather than someone handling another person's life. "We should start with the living room," she said the first morning, clapping her hands lightly as if announcing a project. I sat quietly in the armchair Robert had loved watching as she opened drawers and cabinets I had not touched in years. One by one, objects began disappearing into boxes, photo frames, old recipe books, Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper. Vanessa rarely asked before packing something. She simply picked it up, glanced at it, and decided where it belonged. "This stuff can probably go to storage," she said once, dropping a small wooden carving Robert had made during his retirement into a box. Another time she held up a stack of old photographs. "You might not need all these," she said casually. Need. The word sounded strange when applied to memories. Daniel tried to keep things friendly, but even he had started speaking differently. "We're just getting everything ready, Mom," he would say. Everything. The word seemed to include far more than packing boxes. That night after they left, I walked slowly through the quiet house. The living room looked different already. Small empty spaces had appeared on shelves where familiar objects used to be. The silence felt heavier. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table long after midnight. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the documents again. The neat stack of papers, the quick explanations, my own signature moving across page after page. I kept hearing Daniel's voice. "It's just temporary. It's just paperwork." But the number on the real estate report wouldn't leave my mind. $780,000. The figure repeated itself in my thoughts like an echo. And slowly something inside me began to change. At first the feeling had been fear that I had misunderstood something, fear that I had made a terrible mistake. But as the night stretched on, the fear started turning into something else. Anger. Not loud anger, not the kind that makes people shout. The quiet kind, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. I had spent 35 years working as a nurse. Hospitals teach you many things. One of them is how to recognize when something doesn't feel right. Another is how to stay calm when everyone else around you wants to rush. I had seen families panic in emergency rooms. I had watched doctors make decisions under pressure. I had helped patients who were frightened and confused. Through all of that, one lesson had stayed with me. When something feels wrong, you stop and look closer. You ask questions. You don't simply sign and hope for the best. The next morning, I decided to go to the library. Volunteering there had always helped clear my mind, and I needed the comfort of routine more than ever. The Naperville Public Library smelled the same as it always had: paper dust, and the faint scent of coffee drifting in from the small cafe near the entrance. Carolyn Harper was working at the circulation desk when I walked in. She looked up and smiled. "Well, if it isn't my favorite volunteer," she said. Carolyn and I had been friends for nearly 10 years. She was 71, sharp-minded, and impossible to fool. The moment she saw my face, her smile faded slightly. "Susan?" she said quietly. "What's wrong?" I hadn't planned to tell anyone. But something about standing there among familiar bookshelves made the words come easier. "My son is moving me into a senior living facility," I said. Carolyn blinked. "You don't look like someone who needs a facility." "That's what I thought too." She leaned forward on the counter. "What happened?" So I told her. Not everything, not all at once. But enough. The paperwork, the consultant, the urgency. Carolyn listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her arms and shook her head slowly. "That doesn't sound right," she said. Jason Patel, one of the younger librarians, had been shelving books nearby. He glanced over as we spoke. "Sorry to interrupt," he said politely, "but if you signed legal documents you didn't fully understand, you might want to talk to an attorney." Carolyn nodded immediately. "I know someone," she said. Within 20 minutes we were sitting in a small office near the back of the library, and Carolyn was dialing a number from her phone. "Rebecca Morales," she told me. "She specializes in elder law." The call was brief. Rebecca asked a few careful questions, then told Carolyn she could meet with us that afternoon. Her office was only 15 minutes away. By 3 o'clock, I was sitting across from a woman with dark hair, calm eyes, and the steady confidence of someone used to solving complicated problems. Rebecca Morales read through the copies of the documents Carolyn had helped me print. She didn't speak for several minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious but not surprised. "Mrs. Ellis," she said, "these documents give your son extensive financial authority." My stomach tightened. "Does that mean he can sell my house?" "Possibly," she said carefully, "but that depends on how quickly he moves." She closed the folder gently. "Fortunately, you came to me in time." How much time do we have? I asked. Rebecca met my eyes. 3 days, she said. For the first time since Daniel slid those papers across my kitchen table, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Because in that quiet office sitting across from someone who understood exactly what had happened, I realized something important. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, someone was finally on my side. Rebecca Morales wasted no time once she understood what had happened. Before we do anything else, she said, I need to see the exact documents your son filed with the real estate company. She explained that when property transfers were involved, copies were often held by the brokerage handling the listing. If Daniel had already begun the process of selling the house, there would almost certainly be paperwork waiting somewhere. Do you know which real estate company he contacted? She asked. I nodded slowly. The report Vanessa showed me had a logo on it, I said. Redwood Valley Realty. Rebecca wrote the name down. Then, that's where we start. The next morning, Carolyn insisted on coming with me. You're not walking into a real estate office alone while people are trying to sell your house, she said firmly. Consider me your witness. The Redwood Valley Realty office sat on a quiet commercial street just outside downtown Naperville. Through the front windows, I could see framed property listings lining the walls. Inside the office smelled faintly of printer ink and fresh coffee. A young woman sat behind the front desk typing on a laptop. When she looked up, she greeted us with the polite smile of someone used to meeting potential clients. Good morning, she said. How can I help you? My name is Susan Ellis, I said calmly. I believe your office has documents related to my property on Willow Creek Drive. The receptionist's fingers paused on the keyboard. 1 moment, please. She typed my name into the computer system, scanning the screen carefully. Yes, she said after a moment. Your son contacted us earlier this week. Carolyn and I exchanged a quick glance. The receptionist stood and disappeared into a back office. When she returned, she was holding a slim file folder. These are preliminary documents connected to a potential listing, she explained. She handed the folder to me. I sat down in one of the chairs near the window and opened it slowly. The first document was exactly what Rebecca had expected. Across the top, printed in bold legal type, were the words, General Durable Power of Attorney. My name appeared beneath it, and Daniel's. The document stated clearly that my son now had authority to act on my behalf regarding financial and legal matters, including property transactions. My stomach tightened. The second document was even worse. Warranty deed transfer. The page described the legal process for transferring ownership of real estate property. My house. My home. The place Robert and I had built together. I felt Carolyn lean closer beside me. Can he really do that? She whispered. I closed the folder slowly. That's what we're going to find out, I said. But something else was bothering me. Rebecca had mentioned that Daniel might try to move quickly. That thought stayed with me the entire drive home. Instead of going straight to the house, I asked Carolyn to make one more stop. The U.S. Bank branch on Washington Street. Harold Bennett had been the manager there for years. He had helped Robert and me refinance our mortgage decades earlier, and he still greeted me by name whenever I walked through the doors. When he saw me approach the counter that afternoon, he smiled warmly. Susan, he said, good to see you. I need to check something about my account, I said quietly. Harold noticed the seriousness in my voice and invited us into his office. Once the door closed behind us, I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I recently signed some documents giving my son temporary authority over certain financial matters, I said. I just want to confirm that everything is still where it should be. Harold nodded and turned toward his computer. Let's take a look. The room was silent except for the quiet clicking of his keyboard. After a moment, his expression changed slightly. He looked back at the screen, then at me. Susan, he said carefully, there was a transfer from your savings account yesterday. My heart skipped. A transfer. Harold turned the monitor slightly so I could see the transaction record. $46,000. The entire balance of my savings account, transferred electronically, authorized by Daniel Ellis. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Harold leaned closer to the monitor, frowning slightly as he reviewed the transaction again. I'm sorry, Susan, he said quietly. "Did you authorize this?" I didn't answer. Across the desk, Carolyn leaned forward, staring at the screen. "Susan?" she whispered. Behind us, the soft clicking of keyboards and the distant hum of a printer continued like nothing unusual had happened. But inside that small office, everything suddenly felt different. I looked again at the record. Authorized by Daniel Ellis. The date. The time. Less than a day after I signed those papers at my kitchen table, and in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. This hadn't been confusion. It had been planned. The number felt unreal. That money represented years of careful saving, emergency funds, security for whatever life might still bring. And suddenly, I have to ask you something. If you discovered your own child had taken $46,000 from your account without telling you, what would you do? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this story is making your blood boil like it did mine, take a second to like the video so more people can hear it. Carolyn placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. "Yes," I said. And to my own surprise, I meant it, because something had changed inside me. The fear I had felt the night I signed those papers was gone. In its place was clarity. That evening, when Daniel and Vanessa stopped by again, I watched them differently. Vanessa walked through the living room casually discussing how buyers usually prefer neutral spaces. Daniel stood near the window checking messages on his phone. Neither of them knew I had already seen the documents, or the bank transfer. For the first time since this began, I could see their intentions clearly. Not concern, not protection, greed. When they finally left for the night, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Rebecca Morales. Then I pressed the call button. When she answered, I spoke calmly. "Rebecca," I said, "it's worse than I thought." Monday morning arrived faster than I expected. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting beside Rebecca Morales in a quiet conference room inside the DuPage County Courthouse. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where decisions carried real weight. Rebecca had already spread several documents across the table. "We're moving quickly," she said calmly. "That's our advantage right now." I watched as she pointed to the first form. "This filing revokes the power of attorney you signed," she explained. "Once the court acknowledges it, Daniel can no longer act on your behalf financially." The words felt strangely powerful. For days I had felt as if everything in my life was slipping quietly out of my control. Now for the first time, someone was actively pulling it back. Rebecca moved to the second document. "This notice blocks any attempt to transfer ownership of your home while the situation is under review." I thought about the papers I had seen at Redwood Valley Realty, the warranty deed transfer, the idea that my own house could be quietly sold without my full understanding still felt unreal. And this, Rebecca continued tapping another form, requests a temporary freeze on any accounts that were accessed under that power of attorney. "Does that include the savings Daniel took?" I asked. Rebecca nodded. "We're documenting that transfer as well." I exhaled slowly. For days, the situation had felt like something happening to me. Now it felt like something we were responding to. The filings themselves didn't take long. Rebecca handed the paperwork to a clerk behind a tall glass counter, and after several stamps and signatures, the documents officially entered the system. Just like that, the legal wheels had begun turning. Outside the courthouse, the morning air felt colder than it had when we arrived. Rebecca walked with me toward the parking lot. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "your son finds out the situation has changed." I nodded slowly. And for the first time since this began, I realized something else. I would have to see Daniel again. That afternoon, I drove back to Willow Creek Drive. The house looked the same as always from the outside, the same white siding, the same porch Robert had repainted every few summers. But inside, the air felt different. Daniel and Vanessa were already there. Vanessa stood in the living room sorting through a box of framed photographs. Daniel was in the kitchen scrolling through something on his phone. They both looked up when I walked in. "Mom," Daniel said, sounding mildly surprised. "We thought you were at the library today. I had other things to do." Vanessa smiled politely. "We've been organizing a few things while you were out." I stepped into the kitchen and set my purse on the counter. We need to talk. Something in my voice must have sounded different because Daniel straightened immediately. What's wrong? I went to see a lawyer, I said. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Vanessa slowly set the photo frame she was holding back into the box. A lawyer, Daniel repeated. Yes. The silence stretched across the room. I've revoked the power of attorney I signed. I continued calmly. And the court has been notified. Daniel's expression hardened. You did what I've also filed to prevent any sale of this house while everything is reviewed. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. That's completely unnecessary, she said quickly. We were only trying to help you. Daniel stepped closer. Mom, do you have any idea how complicated you're making this? His voice had lost its patience. It was already complicated, I replied. For a moment he stared at me. Then suddenly his hand closed tightly around my wrist. The movement was so quick it startled me. Listen to me, he said quietly, leaning closer. You're making a huge mistake. His grip tightened. The boy I had once comforted after scraped knees now looked at me like a stranger. Let go of my arm, I said. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably behind him. Daniel, but he didn't move. Mom, you need to think about what you're doing, he said. Lawyers get involved and things spiral out of control. My voice stayed steady. If you don't let go of my arm, I will call the police. The words hung in the air between us. Daniel hesitated. For the first time since this confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he released my wrist. The room went silent. Vanessa looked away. I picked up my purse again. I'm leaving for a while, I said calmly. Neither of them tried to stop me. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Carolyn Harper's living room, wrapped in the familiar comfort of a place that still felt safe. Carolyn placed a mug of tea in front of me and sat down across from me on the couch. You're staying here as long as you need, she said firmly. Through the window I could see the evening light settling across her quiet street. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to breathe, but something inside me had shifted. There was no going back now. Not after the court filings, not after the confrontation, not after seeing the look in Daniel's eyes when I threatened to call the police. I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and sitting there in Carolyn's living room, I finally understood something clearly. The life I had known only a week ago was already gone. The phone started ringing early the next morning. I was sitting at Carolyn's kitchen table when my phone buzzed for the first time. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, it rang again. Then again. By the fifth call, Carolyn raised an eyebrow from across the table. Persistent, she said. That's one word for it. The phone finally stopped ringing after nearly an hour. For a moment, I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. Around noon, Carolyn's doorbell rang. Carolyn walked to the window beside the front door and glanced outside. Well, she said quietly. Your son is here. I took a slow breath. Let him in. Daniel stepped inside carrying a small bouquet of red roses. For a moment, the sight caught me off guard. They looked almost identical to the roses Robert used to grow in our backyard. Mom, Daniel said softly. He held the flowers out toward me. I'm sorry about yesterday. His voice sounded calm again, careful, controlled. Carolyn leaned against the hallway wall, watching the scene without saying a word. I shouldn't have grabbed your arm, Daniel continued. That was wrong. I accepted the flowers, setting them gently on the table. Thank you, I said. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel sat down across from me. You have to understand something, he said. Vanessa and I were only trying to make sure you're taken care of. I folded my hands together. By taking $46,000 out of my account, Daniel's expression flickered. That money wasn't taken, he said quickly. It was moved temporarily, for planning purposes. Planning purposes. He nodded. Managing finances during transitions can get complicated. I studied his face carefully, the calm tone, the carefully chosen words. Everything about this conversation felt rehearsed. Daniel, I said quietly. You tried to sell my house. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? He leaned forward slightly. Mom, lawyers are going to make this ugly. Rebecca Morales doesn't care about this family. She only cares about billing hours. Carolyn finally spoke from behind him. Funny, she said dryly. Because from what I've seen, she's the only one in this story actually helping Susan. Daniel ignored her. Look, he continued, turning back to me. If you drop the legal filings, we can sort this out privately. And if I don't? For the first time that morning, the softness in his voice disappeared. Then things could become complicated. The pause between his words carried a different tone now. Not concern, warning. What does that mean? I asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Well, he said slowly, once lawyers and courts get involved, people start asking questions. What kind of questions? Questions about whether someone your age is still capable of making major decisions on their own. The room went very still. Carolyn straightened behind him. Are you threatening her? She asked sharply. Daniel raised his hands. I'm just explaining how these situations sometimes unfold. But the message was clear. They were going to claim I wasn't competent, that I couldn't manage my own life, that I needed someone else making decisions for me. For a moment, I simply looked at my son. Then I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even shocked anymore. I was simply seeing him clearly. You should go, I said calmly. Daniel stared at me. Mom, you should go, I repeated. He hesitated, then slowly stood. The roses remained on the table between us. Think carefully about what you're doing, he said quietly before heading toward the door. When he left, the house felt lighter. Carolyn shook her head. That boy has lost his mind. But the strange thing was, I felt calmer than I had in days. Because the last piece of confusion had finally fallen away. Daniel wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to control me. Later that afternoon, Carolyn called 2 friends from our bridge club. Linda Foster and Diane Matthews arrived with grocery bags, warm hugs, and the kind of quiet loyalty that only comes from years of friendship. You're not dealing with this alone, Linda said firmly. Diane nodded. We've got your back. For the first time since this nightmare began, the room felt full of support instead of pressure. That evening, Rebecca Morales called. I spoke with opposing counsel today, she said. Opposing counsel, I asked. Yes. Your son has retained an attorney. The words didn't surprise me. And I asked. Rebecca paused for a moment. They're preparing to challenge your decision-making capacity. There it was, exactly what Daniel had hinted at that morning. They're going to argue that you're no longer capable of managing your finances independently, Rebecca continued. If they convince the court, they could try to place financial guardianship over you. Carolyn muttered something under her breath that made Diane laugh. I leaned back in my chair. How strong is their case? I asked. Rebecca's answer came immediately. Not very. The confidence in her voice steadied something inside me. You worked as a registered nurse for decades, she continued. You live independently. You came to me on your own initiative. None of that supports their argument. For a moment, I looked around the room. Carolyn, Linda, Diane, people who had known me for years, people who understood exactly who I was. The fear that had once filled this situation was completely gone now. All that remained was determination. Rebecca, I said calmly. Yes, I took a slow breath. Let's finish this. The evening before the hearing, I returned to my house on Willow Creek Drive. Rebecca had suggested it would be better for me to spend a few hours there before court, just to gather a few personal things I might need. Carolyn insisted on coming with me, but I told her I would be fine. I'll only be there a little while, I promised. The house felt strangely quiet when I unlocked the front door. Several of the boxes Vanessa had packed earlier in the week were still stacked against the living room wall. The sight of them no longer made me feel anxious. Instead, they felt like evidence, proof of how quickly Daniel and Vanessa had tried to erase the life I had built there. I walked slowly through the hallway, letting my hand brush along the familiar wall. Robert's photograph still hung near the staircase. For a moment, I paused there. You would have seen through this faster than I did, I murmured softly. Outside, a car door slammed. A moment later, someone knocked. I didn't need to check the window to know who it was. When I opened the door, Daniel and Vanessa stood on the porch together. Daniel looked tense. Vanessa wore the careful, sympathetic expression she had used many times before. "Mom," Daniel said quietly. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside and let them in. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The silence inside the house felt heavier than usual. Vanessa finally broke it. "Susan," she said gently, "we didn't want things to get this far. The use of my first name instead of Mom didn't escape my notice. We came because we thought maybe we could fix this before tomorrow," Daniel added. I folded my arms. "What exactly do you want to fix?" Vanessa stepped forward slightly. "My mother spent the last 4 years of her life in a nursing home," she began softly. Daniel glanced at her, surprised. "She hated the idea at first," Vanessa continued. "She thought we were abandoning her." Her voice trembled slightly. "But once she settled in, she was safer. She had nurses around the clock. She made friends." She looked directly at me. "Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones families make out of love." For a moment, the room was quiet again. I studied her face carefully. The emotion in her voice sounded convincing, almost too convincing. "And that story has something to do with my house?" I asked calmly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we're trying to find a solution here." Vanessa nodded quickly. "If you drop the case, she said we can work this out privately." "What does that mean?" Daniel took a step forward. "We'll return the money that was moved from your account." "The $46,000, I asked. "Yes," he said. Vanessa added quickly, "and we'll pause the real estate listing process." Pause. Not cancel. Pause. I noticed that detail immediately. "You're asking me to withdraw the legal filings," I said slowly. Daniel nodded. "It would save everyone a lot of trouble." And if I refused, Daniel's expression tightened. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then Vanessa sighed softly. "Well," she said, her tone changing slightly, "court hearings can become very public." "What does that mean?" I asked. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "It means people start asking questions." "About what?" Vanessa answered this time. "About your health," she said quietly. I waited. "And your memory," she added. The shift in the room was immediate. The careful sympathy she had been using moments earlier disappeared. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. Vanessa's voice remained calm. "We're suggesting that the court may want to evaluate whether you're still capable of managing things on your own." Daniel nodded slowly. "There are doctors who specialize in that kind of assessment. So that's your plan," I said. Daniel didn't deny it. "If the court determines you're not fully competent," he said carefully, "they can appoint someone to manage your finances." "Someone like you," Vanessa smiled faintly. "Someone responsible." I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. For weeks they had hidden behind concern and polite explanations. Now the truth was finally standing in the open. "You're planning to tell the court I'm mentally incompetent," I said. Daniel met my eyes. "We're planning to tell the court what we believe is best for you." "And if the court believes you," Vanessa answered before he could, "then the judge could place you under financial guardianship and send me to Brookstone." Vanessa didn't even try to soften it now. "Yes." Daniel glanced toward the window. "We didn't want it to come to this," he said. "But it has," Vanessa finished. The room felt strangely still. I realized something then. They weren't here to reconcile. They were here to warn me. Vanessa turned toward the door. "Tomorrow," she said calmly, "our attorney will present medical evaluations and testimony about your decision-making." She paused, looking back at me. "And once the court sees the evidence," she added, "they'll understand that you shouldn't be living alone anymore." Daniel opened the front door. Vanessa's final words hung quietly in the air. "By this time tomorrow," she said, "the court will know that you're not capable of managing your own life." She stepped outside, and after that, she finished calmly, "moving you into Brookstone will no longer be optional." The courthouse felt colder than usual that morning. Carolyn drove with me to the DuPage County Courthouse just after 8. The sky above Naperville was pale and quiet, the kind of early light that made everything feel suspended in anticipation. Inside the courtroom, the air carried the faint smell of paper and polished wood. People spoke in hushed voices while lawyers shuffled folders and arranged documents across long tables. Rebecca Morales sat beside me, calm and composed as always. Across the aisle, Daniel and Vanessa sat with their attorney, Stephen Callahan. Rebecca had mentioned his name the night before, a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for aggressive courtroom tactics. He looked exactly like someone who enjoyed winning arguments. Daniel glanced in my direction once but quickly looked away. Vanessa didn't look at me at all. At 9 sharp, the judge entered. Everyone stood. The room settled into silence as the hearing began. Rebecca rose first. "Your Honor." She began clearly, "This case concerns the improper use of a general durable power of attorney obtained under circumstances involving pressure and incomplete disclosure." She explained the timeline calmly and directly. The signing at my kitchen table. The attempted property transfer. The removal of funds from my savings account. Stephen Callahan stood when it was his turn. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this is a simple case of a family attempting to care for an elderly parent who may no longer be fully capable of managing her affairs." The word elderly hung in the air like a quiet accusation. He continued, "My clients acted in good faith to ensure Susan Ellis would be safe and properly supported." Rebecca didn't react, but I saw her make a small note on the legal pad in front of her. The judge nodded. "Call your first witness." Stephen stood. "The defense calls Vanessa Ellis." Vanessa walked to the witness stand with careful confidence. She folded her hands politely and looked toward the judge as if she had rehearsed this moment. Stephen approached her gently. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, "can you explain why you and your husband believed Susan Ellis needed additional support?" Vanessa's voice softened. "Susan has been living alone for years," she said. "Recently we noticed signs that she was becoming overwhelmed." "What kind of signs?" "She sometimes forgot small things," Vanessa replied, "and managing a large house alone can be difficult." Stephen nodded sympathetically. "Did you and your husband attempt to find a solution that would keep her safe?" "Yes," Vanessa said. "Brookstone Senior Living offers medical staff and a supportive community." Her tone sounded sincere, almost convincing. Then Rebecca stood. "Permission to cross-examine." The judge nodded. Rebecca approached the witness stand slowly. "Mrs. Ellis," she began, "you testified that your actions were motivated by concern for Susan Ellis's well-being." "Yes. And yet within 24 hours of obtaining power of attorney, your husband transferred $46,000 from her savings account." Vanessa hesitated. "That was part of financial planning." Rebecca lifted a document. "This planning involved moving every dollar from Susan Ellis's savings account into an account your husband controlled." Vanessa shifted slightly. "I wasn't personally involved in the transfer." Rebecca turned toward the judge. "For the record, Your Honor, the financial transfer occurred less than 12 hours after the documents were signed." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. Rebecca turned back to Vanessa. "You also contacted Redwood Valley Realty that same day?" "Correct." Vanessa's voice grew tighter. "Yes. To begin the process of listing Susan Ellis's home. It was only preliminary." Rebecca held up another document. "A warranty deed transfer form was prepared within 48 hours." Vanessa looked toward Stephen. Rebecca's voice remained calm. "No further questions." Vanessa stepped down from the witness stand looking far less confident than when she had walked up. Stephen called the next witness, Daniel Ellis. My son walked to the stand slowly. For a moment I remembered the boy who had once practiced school speeches at our kitchen table. Now he sat beneath courtroom lights, raising his hand to swear an oath. Stephen questioned him first. "Mr. Ellis," he said, "did you believe your mother required assistance managing her finances?" "Yes." "And did you act in what you believed were her best interests?" "Yes." Stephen nodded. No further questions. Rebecca stood. She approached Daniel with the same quiet patience she had shown all morning. "Mr. Ellis," she said, "let's discuss the timing of the financial transfer from your mother's account." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. You moved $46,000 from her savings account within hours of obtaining power of attorney, correct? Yes. Why so quickly? Daniel cleared his throat. We believed she would soon be moving into Brookstone. Rebecca nodded. So you anticipated she would no longer be living in her home? Yes. And you believed that meant you had authority to manage her funds? Yes. Rebecca paused. Then she lifted a printed report. Your Honor, this document was obtained through legal discovery from the defendant's personal computer. Stephen frowned. Rebecca continued. It contains browser history searches made by Mr. Ellis in the days before the financial transfer. She read aloud. How to sell parents' house with power of attorney. Another line. Accessing parents' savings legally. Daniel's face flushed slightly. Rebecca looked directly at him. Mr. Ellis, she said calmly, did you believe the money in your mother's account could be used for your own purposes? Daniel hesitated. For just a moment, the careful answers he had been giving all morning seemed to slip. Well, I assumed I had the right to use it if I needed to. The courtroom was completely silent when Rebecca called my name. Susan Ellis. I stood slowly and walked to the witness stand. The wooden floor seemed louder than usual beneath my steps. For a moment, I could feel every pair of eyes in the room following me. Judge Caroline Whitmore watched calmly as I raised my hand and took the oath. Stephen Callahan stood first. He approached the stand with the confident expression of someone who believed he could dismantle a story piece by piece. Mrs. Ellis, he began politely, your son and daughter-in-law testified that they were concerned about your safety living alone. I heard them. And you admit you signed the power of attorney documents willingly? Yes, I said. Stephen nodded slightly. So no one physically forced you to sign those papers? No. He turned toward the judge briefly. Would you agree that managing a large home finances and daily responsibilities can become difficult as we age? I would agree that life can become difficult at any age. A faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Stephen continued. Mrs. Ellis, have you ever forgotten to pay a bill? Yes. Have you ever misplaced important documents? Yes. So it would be fair to say that your memory is not perfect. I looked at him calmly. Mr. Callahan, I worked as a registered nurse for 35 years. He paused. I've handled medication schedules for dozens of patients at the same time. I continued. I've monitored heart rhythms, managed emergency rooms, and helped families make decisions during medical crises. The courtroom grew very still. I may occasionally forget where I put my reading glasses, I added. But that doesn't mean I've lost the ability to recognize when someone is trying to take my home. Stephen opened his mouth, then closed it again. Rebecca stood. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. Judge Whitmore leaned slightly forward. Mrs. Ellis, she said you came to court today voluntarily. Yes. You sought legal counsel on your own, yes. And you clearly understand the legal issues surrounding your property and finances. Yes, Your Honor. The judge nodded once and made several notes. The room waited. When she finally spoke again, her voice was firm and unmistakably clear. The court finds no evidence that Susan Ellis lacks the mental capacity to manage her own affairs. A quiet breath seemed to release across the courtroom. The general durable power of attorney is hereby revoked. She paused briefly before continuing. The attempted warranty deed transfer is void. Rebecca exhaled beside me. The financial transfer of $46,000 is to be returned to Susan Ellis within 48 hours. Stephen Callahan remained very still. Judge Whitmore looked toward Daniel. In addition, she continued the court issues a restraining order requiring Daniel Ellis and Vanessa Ellis to remain no less than 500 feet from Susan Ellis and her property. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. Outside the courtroom, Rebecca turned to me. You handled that beautifully, she said. Carolyn hugged me tightly, but Rebecca's expression remained serious. There's one more step we should discuss, she said quietly. What kind of step? Elder financial abuse charges. I thought about the past 2 weeks, the paperwork, the lies, the moment Daniel had grabbed my wrist in my own kitchen. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. Within days, the investigation moved quickly. Financial records, property documents, court transcripts, the evidence spoke for itself. When the police finally placed Daniel in handcuffs outside his office building, reporters were already waiting. News spreads quickly in a place like Naperville, especially when it involves a financial advisor accused of stealing from his own mother. By the end of the week, the story had reached nearly every corner of the community. Daniel's firm suspended him immediately. Clients began withdrawing accounts. The reputation he had spent years building collapsed almost overnight. And as the scandal spread, one truth became impossible for anyone to ignore. The man who had tried to control his mother's life had just lost control of his own. The legal consequences unfolded faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, Daniel accepted a plea deal tied to the financial abuse charges. The investigation had uncovered more than just the transfer from my account. His firm terminated him almost immediately, citing violations of professional ethics. Not long after that, the news spread that Vanessa had filed for divorce. The life they had tried so carefully to construct collapsed piece by piece. I heard most of it from Carolyn or from quiet conversations around Naperville. People talk in a town like this, especially when a scandal touches someone they recognize. But by then I had already stopped paying much attention. I had something far more important to reclaim: my life. Spring arrived slowly that year. The roses Robert planted behind the house on Willow Creek Drive began blooming again, just as they always had. Every morning I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and walked through the garden. The air smelled like damp soil and fresh leaves, and the quiet felt peaceful instead of lonely. Carolyn still visited often, usually bringing news from our bridge club or insisting we take small day trips together. On Tuesdays, I returned to volunteering at the Naperville Public Library. Carolyn and Jason always greeted me with the same warm smiles as before, and the routine of shelving books felt wonderfully normal. A few weeks later, I met Richard Hale during one of Carolyn's neighborhood gatherings. He was a retired history teacher with a calm voice and an easy laugh. Sometimes we took short drives along the Fox River or stopped for lunch at small cafes outside town. Nothing dramatic, just simple, quiet moments. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Daniel. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Inside was a long message that drifted awkwardly between apology and explanation. He spoke about stress, poor judgment, and how events had spiraled beyond his control. I read it once. Then I folded the pages carefully and carried them outside. The paper burned quickly in the small metal fire bowl beside the garden. A thin ribbon of smoke curled slowly into the evening air. Behind me, the rose bushes Robert planted years ago swayed gently in the quiet breeze. The first blossoms of the season had already begun to open. For a moment, I simply stood there watching the edges of the paper turn black and fold into ash. The words that had once felt heavy in my hands were now nothing more than drifting gray dust. I let out a slow breath. The garden was quiet again. And somewhere in that quiet, I felt something return to me that I thought I had lost. Peace. Watching the smoke disappear into the evening air, I realized something simple. Sometimes protecting your own life means refusing to let someone else rewrite it. At 73 years old, I hadn't lost my independence. I had saved it. And now I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, if your own child tried to take your home, your savings, and your freedom, would you still forgive them? Tell me honestly in the comments. If you believe every parent deserves dignity and respect, take a moment to like this video and share it so more people can hear this story. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel for more powerful family stories like mine.